Welcome to our third lecture in the series entitled The Quest for Spiritual Pathways. Tonight's talk is entitled The Science of the Holy Grail. Now, most of you might think that that's an oxymoron because the Holy Grail for most people is a legend, it's a myth, it's something that is intangible, it's unseen, and most people probably think it doesn't exist. But Rudolf Steiner told us that we should develop a science of the Grail. And we're going to talk about that in this evening's presentation. Now, I want to go back a moment to the first talk because I want to point out something. If we're talking about the Holy Grail, we pointed out in the first talk called transhumanism that you must decide whether you're going to become an angel or perhaps something much less, an animal or even a mechanical human. You must decide that. And at the moment that you decide that, you're going to also have to figure out who you are, where you have come from, where you are now, and where you're going in the future. And if you don't know that, you do not have a cosmology. And therefore, you don't know what your worldview is. You actually have nothing to compare knowledge to. And all knowledge must be compared to other knowledge for it to make any sense, Rudolf Steiner said. There's no such thing as knowledge on its own. So if you do not have a cosmology, you cannot explain who you are. Now, we pointed out that generally in the West, Christian esotericism, we would say that we are evolving into an angel. So a transhuman is transitioning into an angel. And this would be normal. Now, Christian esotericism says there are 9 ranks of these angels. And I mentioned them last time. We can go through that list, but we're going to talk a little bit further about that as we go along in this series, because without a cosmology, you can't understand some of the deeper secrets of the Holy Grail. As a matter of fact, one could literally say that the quest for the Holy Grail is a quest for a cosmology to find out where you came from in the divine and how to get back there. In other words, the descent and the ascension, going back to where you came from. And we mentioned in the first talk, C.G. Harrison, and the fact that he has given 3 spiritual axioms, which we will refer to again and again. The first one being, the human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm. In other words, in modern science, they call it a 3D hologram of the universe. We are that. Second rule of the Spirit is everything that moves in rhythms moves in a rhythm of 7. And we talked about this descent through the ancient periods, which are called the mothers. And now we're going to give them the names that Rudolf Steiner gives them: Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth. And the first half of the Earth, we found out, and the first 3 periods are all a donation of those angels. And those angels at all the different ranks have fallen down into matter. And we're going to talk about the angel that we hear most about, Lucifer, tonight. So without that cosmology, without understanding this hierarchy, you may not be able to really figure out your worldview. So Rudolf Steiner said that one version of the Holy Grail is the philosophical view developed by Dionysius the Areopagite in his book, The Divine Names. And when this book was brought to Charlemagne's court, a court which had literally the spear that stabbed the side of Christ, according to what Charlemagne was told by Pope Leo III, this was a court of the Grail. And in this court, when the translation of Dionysius the Areopagite came to that court, it was considered the Holy Grail of philosophy. In other words, if you understand the 9 hierarchy, you understand the Holy Grail. It is the Holy Grail. And in the second talk, we presented the biographies of the divine feminine trinity. And in that, we pointed out that there are 3 different beings: the mother, the daughter, and the Holy Sophia, or what Rudolf Steiner calls the being of Anthroposophia. Much confusion around all of that, but we're going to come back to that again in our discussion of the Grail, because the mothers, these periods, these 3 periods, Saturn, Sun, Moon, and now we're in the Earth period. Of course, we understand that period because we are in it. But what that was a donation of the mothers. It was also the fall of the angels into matter. Now, some would say that's evil, But Rudolf Steiner says there is no evil. Evil is only for a time. It's only for a certain period of time. And what happens with evil is it is redeemed. Now, I didn't go as far as I wanted to in the last talk about the divine Sophia and about the being of Anthroposophia. I forgot to tell you about what Rudolf Steiner said was the mission of our time in terms of Anthroposophia. He said we needed to write a new myth, a new mythology of Isis. And then he gave us two different versions of that story, one in Ancient Myths, the lecture's Ancient Myths, and another one in the New Isis Mysteries. And he describes this being of Isis. And he says that now we must resurrect Isis into a new form, the form of Anthroposophia. And once we do, then we will actually see that the gifts of the mother are absolutely critical. They're the gifts of wisdom, the gifts of the being of the Kyrioteites, as I mentioned last time, or the beings of wisdom. But there is also, that's the mother, and then there's the being of wisdom, and then there's the being of Anthroposophia. So I did not say this, but I should have. All ancient mysteries have one secret in the middle. In the core of that mystery, you will always find one mystery. And that mystery is the mystery of the triple goddess that is called the Great Goddess. And this is what we described in this second lecture series when we were describing the biographies of the divine feminine trinity. Now, this is critical as we look at the Holy Grail because of something that was mentioned in the first lecture. Materialism in our time has literally taken on a human form. And Rudolf Steiner calls that materialism the being of Ahriman. And he says that in our time, in 2000 AD, Ahriman has incarnated. What I didn't mention is that in 2000 BC, the other aspect of what we would call Satan, Lucifer, incarnated in 2000 BC as the counterpoint for Christ's incarnation at the mystery of Golgotha. So for 2,000 years before, it was the influence of Lucifer that we were feeling. And Lucifer has been here, of course, since the time that the angels fell to the earth. And Ahriman, the being of materialism, has risen up as another rank of these fallen angels and works with other beings who are other fallen angels. But this being of Lucifer, absolutely critical to understand this, because what is the Holy Grail? The Holy Grail is the green stone, the jewel of the crown of Lucifer, which was knocked from the crown by the archangel Michael with a fiery sword of power that was given to Michael by who we call in Christian esotericism, the Father God who was sitting on the throne and gave Michael this sword to strike from the crown of Lucifer this green stone. Now, Lucifer fell to the earth along with the green stone, and I'll describe that story in a moment. But that green stone became the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail that was supposedly used, allegedly used, at the Last Supper. And that is another story that we'll tell in just a moment. But if we look at the big story of how it is that such a high being, some say that Lucifer was a seraphim, the highest of the hierarchy, the beings of love, and that fall down to the earth really was a picture of what the human being went through in the fall from the Garden of Paradise. And later, when that bowl was used to catch the blood of Christ on the hill of Golgotha, in the mystery of Golgotha, at the death of Jesus of Nazareth, when he became the Christ, or what we would call the entire life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, who became the Christ. This bowl was used not only at the Last Supper, supposedly, but it was used to catch the blood. And at that moment that Lucifer's stone caught the blood of Christ, supposedly the whole earth was redeemed. And what we would have known as the pre-Christian myths of the blood myths, the blood mysteries, the mythologies that describe blood, and unfortunately bloodletting, is part of what must be conquered if you wish to understand the Holy Grail. Anna Kingsford writes and gives us 3 spiritual axioms that must be met before the age of woman can come to birth, the age of the Satya Yuga, which was, according to some, happened in 1899, according to Rudolf Steiner, and started in 3101 BC, as we mentioned before. So for 5,000 years, we lived in the darkness that made sure that we did not understand that the great goddess, who is at the core of all ancient mysteries, all the mystery centers, was completely obfuscated, was completely endarkened, was supplanted. And we can go into thinking that that's a bad thing, that the patriarchy took over for the matriarchy, as we discussed last time, but it was necessary. It was necessary for human beings to enter into the material world so that we could become independent thinkers. And this is what happened when Lucifer actually incarnated in a human being in 2000 BC, according to Rudolf Steiner, in the Central Asian Mystery Center. And there, Lucifer took the wisdom that existed at the time, basically synthesized it, put it into some libraries, which we have now discovered in the exact place Rudolf Steiner said they would be discovered. And all the wisdom of the world, Lucifer was trying to gather into one place. But one thing Rudolf Steiner said was left over from that incarnation of Lucifer, who was literally a spiritual being who for one time would become a human being to understand what it was like to be a human being. Just as Ahriman, one time and one time only, is incarnated now to understand what it's like to be a human. As the counterpoles to the Christ from the divine Trinity, coming all the way down through the ranks of the hierarchies, down to the 10th rank, the human rank, and being a human. And so what we really have here is a picture from the beginning of Lucifer representing humanity and this fall into matter, and now hopefully the reascent. And the beautiful part of the Grail is that Lucifer will be redeemed. According to Rudolf Steiner, Lucifer is redeemed by the Holy Spirit and by the being of Sophia, who we often call the Holy Sophia. And when this being Sophia works with the Holy Spirit, Lucifer can be redeemed. But Lucifer could not look upon the mystery of Golgotha, could not look upon Christ on the cross. And the being of Ahriman could not look upon that event because they can never understand it, because they are not in the realm that we're in. They do not have freedom, and they are not developing love out of freedom, which is our mission. And really, that's the mission of the Holy Grail, isn't it? So we can discuss the different mythologies, legends, ecclesiastical tales, historical tales, and all of these different things, so that it is no longer just a mythology, but it becomes a science. And we mentioned that the second book of the Gospel of Sophia goes into a very clear scientific explanation of exactly how the Holy Grail works in the human body. Rudolf Steiner calls it the etherization of the blood, which we will be discussing in a future lecture. But it is a science, and it is in the human body. And so the idea that the Grail is outside of you is only true to the extent that as a microcosm, as a small version of the macrocosm, we can understand that the microcosm of the Grail is in our body, but there's also a macrocosmic version of it, which was brought to us by the being of Christ. So we have these different events, and if we're going to talk about these different events that are considered to be religious, ecclesiastical, mythological, and for some, simply an imagination, we need to remember that we're dealing with symbols. We're dealing with ideas that are put into symbols, and we need to interpret them. So let's think for a second. What is a Holy Grail? If we go back to Lucifer's fall, we find that all the angels were gathered around the throne. And this throne was so brilliant, no one could look at it. And from that throne came warmth, light, nourishment, and life, even the insinuation of eternal life. And so I would suggest that the throne of God is the first Grail that we ever saw. Because right there, we hear the story of the fall of Lucifer And we know that Lucifer will be redeemed, as we're told in this fall. But what we also see are the same magical tools, some of the same magical elements that we find in many other Holy Grail stories. So we find that Michael has a flaming sword, but also you'll hear that Michael has a spear, a fiery spear, and that Gabriel was there too, right next to the throne. And we'll talk a little bit about the special Holy Grails that stayed with Gabriel in heaven. But first, Lucifer saw this, what I would call the Holy Grail. He saw the throne of God and said, I want that. I want to sit on that throne. And God said, according to some legends and versions, no, this throne is reserved for the human being. It is reserved for Adam and Eve, these two beings right here next to the throne. And Lucifer became enraged by that, jealous, envious, and said, no way will I ever bow to this low human being. And so that started Lucifer on his path to go into the dark realms of heaven and compound what Lucifer could into stones that would shine. But these stones didn't shine with light. They shone with non-effulgent light, self-contained light, selfish light. And so when Lucifer had compounded all these materials, Lucifer also created a sword and gathered up whatever beings Lucifer could, the other beings who had fallen into this state, this fallen state, and they attacked the throne. Michael defended it, struck the stone from Lucifer's head, opened with the spear the veil of heaven so that Lucifer could fall. By that time, Lucifer had turned into a dragon. And Lucifer fell right after the stone. So the stone fell first, Lucifer fell after it, and with its mighty tail, Lucifer the dragon pulled 1/3 of humanity away from the throne of God down into this dark realm. That's the story we're told. Now, what we're not told very much about is that the being of the human being was created. Of course, in Genesis it says that God created them in his own image. Man and woman created he him, which means that to begin with, man and woman had to be there, especially because they were falling into the realm of duality. So we hear a great deal about a being called Adam Kadmon, the first Adam. We hear hardly anything about Eve Kadmon, but we must place her there. It's absolutely critical. Just as if we were to believe in the Trinity, which is the gift of Lucifer. The gift of Lucifer is to tell humanity through the works of the Gnostics, according to Rudolf Steiner, that the divine is a trinity. Now, we're telling you that the divine is two trinities, a male and a female. For Brahma, for instance, in the ancient Hindu philosophy, Brahma had his consort. So Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Shiva had Kali as his consort, who the Grail mysteries actually in India go back to Shivaism, which is really a worship of the divine feminine. And so Vishnu had Lakshmi, and Brahma had Vak in one of her forms. But Vak was the one who spoke first, and all 6 of these beings came into existence at once. 3 males, 3 females. This is the way that it works. If you look closely, you'll find that in the ancient Persian, you'll find it all throughout so many creation myths that it is absolutely ubiquitous. So when the Holy Grail, which is the I am of the human being, which is in the human heart, which is represented by Lucifer, Lucifer represents the I am of conscious thinking. So in 2000 BC, we call it the Abrahamic age, the age of Abraham, the age when abstract thinking began, and the age when the being of Sophia came to the earth and started basically becoming the collective consciousness of human intelligence. And this goes on to this very day. So it was at that time that Lucifer, and even before that time, for 1,000 years, started to take the wisdom of Sophia, who Steiner called at that point Isis, or Isis Sophia, and took that wisdom, according to Rudolf Steiner, in a very beautiful poem that he wrote about this, carried the being of Sophia away from the realm of the earth so that human beings could no longer see her, and took her to beyond the realm of the stars, where she was hidden. And in some cases, they say that Lucifer or Ahriman took another aspect of Sophia, Isis, and carried her into the earth so that she would be hidden there. Well, this is what is now over. The age of Kali Yuga, the age of darkness from 3101 BC until now, until 1900, so we're past that point, that was the age of darkness. We have to leave that behind. So when we enter into the mysteries of those times, what do we find? The divine feminine trinity. And when we look at the divine feminine trinity, what do we find? That Isis says, I am the all and everything. I am the past, the present, and the future. No man has lifted my veil and lived. Well, Rudolf Steiner says in the new myth of Isis, it's a little bit different. Same first words. I am the all and everything. I am the past, present, and future. But every person must lift my veil. And this is really the veil that hides what the Holy Grail is. So when we can understand that the Holy Grail is this mystery of the prodigal son, represented by Lucifer, who falls down into matter from its inherited place where the Adam Kadmon and the Eve Kadmon are still there, hidden behind the throne of God by the archangel Gabriel. And the way that the legend is told. And not for a long time do those beings ever come down to earth. So when the Mary and Jesus, according to Rudolf Steiner, who were born in Nazareth, those were the same beings of Adam Kadmon and Eve Kadmon. It was the first time that they had ever come to the earth, and it would be the last time that those bodies would ever come to the earth. They were the Holy Grail of human evolution. Well, Christ also had something similar, which I won't go into explaining, but Christ also had a perfect aspect called the Adam Kadmon. And when the Adam Kadmon incarnated in Nazareth, there was also another Jesus child born at the same time, which we talked about last lecture. And there were also two Marys. So this merging of two Marys and two Jesus children is, again, a fantastic, according to Rudolf Steiner, a fantastic view of what the Holy Grail really is. Because the Marys, who the mother of Jesus was actually always called Sophia, according to tradition, not Mary. So I will refer to her as Sophia. So the Sophia who stood underneath the cross at the mystery of Golgotha was not the mother of the Jesus, the Adam Kadmon that was on the cross. Now, this is hard to understand, but the being of wisdom had come in and filled the being who had been Eve, the literal Eve. And she had brought this being of wisdom, the Karyotetes, had brought the pure Eve Kadmon to Mary, who became Sophia at that moment, who held then all this wisdom, not only the wisdom that Jesus of Nazareth had given over to her, but the wisdom of the beings of the Karyotetes. And this makes then Mary, 11 years after the crucifixion, as she followed in the path of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, who ascended into heaven, in other words, the first human being who showed us the path, the spiritual pathway for ascension. So did Mary. During her assumption, after 3 days of lying in dormition, Mary rose up into heaven before the 72 disciples. And when she rose up into heaven, this was the perfect resolution of the descent and the ascension. And so we have Jesus and Mary, or Jesus and Sophia, or Christ and Sophia, representing exactly what the human being needs to do if they wish to follow the path of the Holy Grail, if you wish to understand what the future of cosmology presents for us. Now, Rudolf Steiner said many things about the Holy Grail, and I could literally list for you 20, 30 different things that he says the Holy Grail is. And he gives from different perspectives a different view of that. One perspective that he gives in Christ and the Spiritual World, the lecture series, is he says that the moon, when it's a sickle moon, and you can look at that moon and still pretty much see the rest of the moon there, but it hasn't come yet because it's not full, you are seeing a picture of the Grail. Because that moon, as it waxes, is like the human I am, the human Grail, that grows bigger until it becomes the full representation of the sun. So the sickle moon is like a human being, but the full moon is going to be more like what an angel might be, reflecting the sun light, which again gives us warmth, light, nourishment, and life, perhaps even eternal life, directly from this Grail. Many versions of what the Grail is. And what we found is that when you look at 4 different areas that you can see described in the Bible, the fall of Lucifer, the fall from paradise, the mystery of Golgotha, and the descent of New Jerusalem as described in the book of Apocalypse or in the book of St. John's Revelation. So each of those has some type of Grail there. In the first one, the throne of God is the Grail. In the second one, it's the tree of life. And there's the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in the Garden of Paradise. Now, what is seldom known is that when Adam and Eve were kicked out, and by the way, it was not a bad thing that Eve did. She listened to the snake, Lucifer, and she's listening to the snake on the tree, the world tree. And that's the world tree of good and evil. Well, the world tree of good and evil can be found in your body and your nerve system. Your nerve system tells you through your senses what is good and what is evil. But what can't be reached, and you can reach it through your consciousness, but what can't be reached is the tree of life. And out of that tree of life come, of course, we're always told, 4 rivers that bring everything that you need, that feed these trees and everything in the garden. So everything is there. It's absolutely perfect. It's like being before the throne of God in the original story. But then we fell. Now, one thing I want to clarify right now is that Anna Kingsford said 3 things that are absolutely beautiful in her book, The Perfect Way. One of them is, we must end all association with blood sacrifice. Second thing is, we must end all association with idols and idolatry. Third thing is, we must end the curse of Eve. Or else we cannot enter the age of woman. We cannot enter the Satya Yuga. We cannot enter the age of light until we have ended the curse of Eve. So to believe that it was Eve's fault that we got kicked out of paradise is silly. That is part of the program. That was what was supposed to have happened. What she did was considered a curse, but in fact, it was the great blessing. That apple, one could say, is in fact somewhat of a holy grail. It brought them to the consciousness of their own self-consciousness, what we call Abraham, when you can have abstract thoughts, when you can actually have cognition that you can control, when you can literally begin to think about the fact that you can think. This is really what Eve brought. And so we need to end the curse of Eve. And that is what the second talk was all about, ending the curse of Eve. Because if you do not, you cannot reach the wisdom that is behind the ancient mysteries that tell you about the Grail. Now, we also mentioned the island of Crete, and we mentioned that the goddess, the queen goddess of the island of Crete, was really the goddess of birth, death, and rebirth. And we described how the first throne of Europe was the birthing throne found in the kiva, this kind of pregnant belly of the woman, a kiva. It looks just like the domed building with the hole in the top that they would climb down a ladder, and no man was ever allowed in there because those were the mysteries of birth. Those were the mysteries of blood. And the women held those mysteries. And so when we're talking about the Holy Grail, people will tell you that it's the blood of Christ in the Grail that is healing you, that is giving you the nourishment, that is creating this interaction with the spiritual beings that are connected to the Grail. Well, first we must realize that women in their uterus have an upside-down grail, which is represented by Gabriel giving Mary the lily and recognizing that she was pregnant with the divine being, the Christ, this Adam Kadmon. And so when you look at any grail, whether it be the Grail of Valencia or the Grail of Raqqa, any of the grails that are beyond the time that Christ was on the earth, so 1st century, one of them goes back to the 4th century BC, you will see two grails, a dish this way and a dish this way. And the dish, both of them are stones, and both of them are simply carved out stones. But they're connected so that they create this very chalice-like looking goblet. And this is the standard view of what the Grail is. Well, this is, in fact, what Rudolf Steiner described as the human heart. Steiner described in Universe, Earth, and Man, in lecture 14 and 15, that there are forces coming up from the earth that are actually coming from the far distant stars. Those would be the forces of Sophia, the forces of the mothers, which he said is one mother. So the mother comes up through your feet, and she creates a bowl, either inverted as the uterus, and Rudolf Steiner says then that is replicated in the human larynx, where it then becomes another grail. And this grail is then something that we can give birth through our words to all kinds of things in the future. But you see these two different grails, and they connect, and they interpenetrate. Well, the forces from below are a vortex, as we pointed out, C.G. Harrison's spiritual axiom. All phenomenon in the world arises from vortices. So the one coming from below is literally all of the wisdom of the stars. It's the wisdom of the mothers. It's the wisdom of Saturn, Sun, Moon. It's the wisdom coming up into you. And he says it moves at a faster speed. And in fact, we now know that our galaxy is moving at a huge speed. But from above comes the forces of love, the forces of Christ, the forces of the sun and the planets and the moon, and they're coming down from above. And generally, we see that as this dove or this Holy Spirit of Christ descending into the chalice, into this grail. And we're often not aware that the bottom part is the feminine, the wisdom. The top part is the male. And what we usually see in most of the Grail stories, from the Mabinogian, from the Celts, the Irish, the Welsh, from India, Persia, we hear all these different stories of this wondrous cauldron, this cauldron that was the cauldron of creation. And so this cauldron that comes up below, this vortex that comes up from below, is in fact the past. And we were supposed to have conquered those things, these lower chakras, before we came into this time. And now our mission is to work with the chakras that go from the heart up. So we have the forces of love coming through Christ into the heart. We have the forces of wisdom coming from Sophia into the heart. And Rudolf Steiner says when they meet, the forces of wisdom are moving faster than the forces of love. And it creates somewhat of an incongruency. And this incongruency creates the axis of our heart, the same exact axis of the earth. And so this lack of integration is where then you would call it an accretion zone if you were talking about supermassive black holes and ion jets, which is the same thing, by the way. But this accretion zone, in other words, where the descending Holy Spirit or the descending love meets the wisdom, what happens? Somehow this blood of a higher being, we discussed it as the ichor, the blood of the gods, enters into the human being's realm, into this chalice, into this heart. Steiner calls it the silhouette of the heart. These two vortices create a silhouette of the heart so that the heart can then act inside of that form. That is the form of the Holy Grail. And he describes it in quite accurate details which I'll be giving descriptions of when we describe the heart and the etheric formative forces. Because this area of your heart is where the Holy Grail is supposed to receive love and wisdom and then give out freely what it is that you were given, which is the understanding of wisdom and love. And then you would become a Grail like the sun, a Grail like the tree of life, a Grail like the cross of Christ, who when he died upon it, redeemed the earth, which was going into entropy. It was dying. At the moment that the blood of Christ, just like so many creation stories, when the blood drops into the vessel, and the earth is the vessel of the mothers, when that blood dropped into the vessel of the mothers, the earth became a star. It started to become a star. It started to have what's called ectropy, levity, true life. And so Christ's gift was the end of all blood sacrifices. As Anna Kingsford tells us, we must end all blood sacrifices, even if it's a God saying that they're sacrificing through vicarious atonement human beings. This isn't what's happening. Christ was the example of what all of us go through. And the Grail of Christ, the stone of Lucifer, is inside of us. The spear that stabbed the side of Christ, that is inside of us also. The flaming sword of Michael is inside of us. And when we learn to use these tools, then you learn to actually turn the Holy Grail from a myth into a science of ascension. So underneath the cross, you have 3 men and 3 women who were able to witness what happened there. The 3 Marys, or Sophia and the other 2 Marys. You have John the Beloved, who then Christ said, this is your mother and this is your son. He wedded them together in a way. And then you have, of course, Longinus, and you have Joseph of Arimathea, who brought what is called the Bowl of Solomon, which is the green stone that fell from the heavens, was taken up by the king of Tyre, who was, of course, mythical, and turned into a bowl and given to Solomon. Or it is said that perhaps the king of Tyre gave it to the queen of Sheba, and the queen of Sheba gave it to Solomon. One way or the other, Solomon had the bowl, and it was inside the Holy of Holies, and Joseph of Arimathea brought it out to use at the Last Supper and to catch the blood of Christ. So whether it's those 3 men and those 3 women, again, 3 and 3, but Longinus, what is Longinus' position in all of this? Longinus was a centurion, and for 2 years he had been tasked with watching Christ and his disciples and hoping they made a mistake so he could then turn them in. But what happened? There on the crucifixion, he became the first Christian who converted. Because as the being of Michael, because we know or are told in the story, Longinus is blind. So who led the hands of Longinus to pierce exactly the side of Christ at the exact moment when water and blood would come out, which proved that the body had died? That's what that means. It's very complicated that people say there are 2 vials. Joseph of Arimathea caught the water and the blood. Joseph of Arimathea, along with Nicodemus and Longinus, took the body down from the cross, cleaned it up, and continued to catch this blood because they considered it sacred. Longinus, at the moment that he stabbed Christ in the side, the blood squirted out so powerfully that it went into his eyes and he was no longer blind. But at that moment, the spearhead, which was also had meteorite in it, which I'll explain in just a minute, but it was a hasta, a centurion hasta spearhead, hasta novia magus, the highest one that they could make, and they were made in Israel because they put meteorite in it. And this spearhead then, of course, because it had the blood of Christ on it, and he converted, and he then stayed with Mary for the next 11 years, and then stayed with Joseph of Arimathea for the rest of his life once they traveled to England. He, of course, would have given this spearhead, this spear that stabbed the side of Christ, to the mother of Jesus, to Sophia, to Mary. Of course he would have. And why would anyone doubt that the chalice would come to her? Why would anyone doubt that the shroud that he was wrapped in, or the veil of Veronica, or the ropes that held him when he was being whipped, or the crown of thorns, or the nails from the cross, or parts of the cross, why would not the blood relics of Jesus come to his mother? And then we know that they were told to continue the Last Supper rites, and they used, to this very day in the Russian church, a chalice and a spear that represents the spear of Longinus. They cut the bread with the spear before they put it into the wine. And so the spear and the cup go together. In all of the old 7 branches of the Mabinogion or the Welsh legends, or all these older stories, what we are finding is that the Grail is not really anything physical. Rudolf Steiner said there is no such thing as blood relics left by Jesus of Nazareth. He said there were none left. So if we believe that, then we also can then take the injunction of Anna Kingsford that every one of those relics is idolatry. Because it wasn't the chalice that was to be found. It was the substance of the chalice. Some would say it was the blood of Christ. Some would say that it's this life. Some say that when they looked at it, they saw the host. Well, in the ancient stories, which then were taken, the pre-Christian stories, were all developed by people who had clairvoyance, especially the women. That's the reason the women were the sibyls. That's the reason they were the person who spoke at the oracles, because the women still had clairvoyance. So those who had clairvoyance could look at these things and see what they truly were. So when you look into the human heart, you see this Grail, and you see the 2 parts of the Grail, going up and going down. But Longinus carried the tradition of the spear. And this spear, in the old stories, the Grail maidens, who did not have to become Grail seekers, they were already there with the Grail in the Grail castle. Mary did not have to seek the Grail, they were brought to her. So when Adam and Eve left the Garden of Paradise, an archangel brought the stones of paradise, and they were called Zohar, which were Grails. They gave warmth, light, nourishment, and life. And they were even used, called the Stone of On, in Noah's Ark. So the tradition that the stones of paradise, or the crown of Lucifer, the stone from the crown of Lucifer falling down, has to do with stones, which is a great mystery. People don't quite understand what this means. And when you look at the historical stories, how many different things are referred to as the Grail? Well, we'd have to say a broken sword, a fiery spear, because the spear was always held above either a Grail, a chalice, a cup, or a platter, and it continuously dripped blood. In other words, the moment of creation, because most creation stories go back to that. So as it dripped into this chalice, this was the Grail procession. And then behind it would become what were platters, what were also called Grails. They were platters of food. And whatever the Grail story says, whatever you wanted, if you asked for it properly, you would be given. And so when the Grail Knight, who had quested and found the spiritual pathway to this, through the wasteland, to the Grail castle, he found, with the stories we've heard, that there was a wounded king there. Wounded by what? The spear that stabbed the side of Christ. Stabbed the side, the thigh of the Grail king, and made the Grail king ineffectual to keep the kingdom alive and healthy with strong etheric force. So when you get there and you're the Grail Knight, and you've gone on this great path, and you've been the seeker of the Grail, and now you meet the keepers of the Grail, and you see the king and the queen of the Grail, because there's always a queen, no one mentions that. The queen and the queen isn't harmed. The king is the one who is harmed and who has caused the kingdom to turn into a wasteland through his sin. The only way to redeem the sin is for the Grail Knight to ask 3 questions. What is the Grail? Who does the Grail serve? And brother, what ails you? And so once that is asked, which it wasn't by the first visits of these Grail Knights, Galahad and Percival, all the Grail Knights who made it to the castle, Grail Castle, not many of them passed the test because they didn't have what? The inquisitiveness for the quest. They didn't know what the path they were on was. And they didn't have the compassion to ask, brother, what ails thee? In other words, get out of their own quest, and when they find what it is that they are looking for, consider the other. And the Grail quest is not finished until the Grail winner, in the case of Percival, brings his brother also before the Grail. You have to bring someone else to bring them to this. It isn't good enough to do it yourself. The Grail cannot be attained without love, and love can't happen unless there's two or more people involved. Now, we know that some people would say this is strict animism, that the stone that fell from the heavens was a meteorite, and that these meteorites were then held sacred by many. And the very stones, the Zohars that came from paradise, were then found again in the very spear that stabbed the side of Christ. Now, in a minute, we'll go to the picture of New Jerusalem, because it completes the cosmology. Because New Jerusalem is when you have perfected your own soul. Steiner calls it the consciousness soul, but the higher part of it's called the spiritual soul. So the Grail happens when your spiritual soul, defined by Rudolf Steiner, merges with your spiritual self. In other words, when your pure white self, which has the robe of pure virginity on, becomes a pure virgin soul, you then get to marry, when New Jerusalem descends from heaven, the Lamb who had been wounded and was healed. That, of course, is Christ. And so this is a merging of your soul to your higher self. That's what the Grail is. The Grail is finding that your I am in your heart is not dedicated to Lucifer and selfishness or to Ahriman and hatred, but is dedicated to Christ, so that Christ sits upon the throne of your heart. Christ is in that Grail, and you are that. And when you merge with your higher self, you become that. But there are many, many other mysteries to the Grail that need to be looked at. For instance, I told you before that when they spoke of the great goddess, they said she was out in the stars and she was the Milky Way, and that all the philosophers, Sophia, the lovers of Sophia, drank from the milk of the goddess from the Milky Way. And this sounds like nonsense. But then I pointed out that it's not nonsense at all. The closest thing to mother's milk is a substance found in the stars and space called galactose. And it does come to the earth periodically, and it may have been part of the seeding of DNA into this earth. But that does not diminish the gifts of the spiritual beings, the mothers who created all of this. It's part of it. So what I'm about to tell you is going to probably shock you. Well, first off, I should say, meteorites are found in every single animistic, aboriginal belief and system that there is on the face of the earth. Rudolf Steiner said 10 different times, get meteorites and work with them. He said, get meteoric iron, get meteoric iron. He created a medicament to bring meteoric iron into your blood. So when we're talking about meteoric iron, we're talking about what the son of Cain, Tubal Cain, took a meteorite and hammered it into a sword and a spear that became the sword of power for the Jews, for the Hebrews, and the spear of power. That very spear was brought to the crucifixion of Christ, and it's called the spear of Phinehas. And it was banished, it was vanquished by the spear of Longinus that became the spear of love and mercy. And Longinus was the first soldier of God. Longinus was the first convert. Longinus then became the image that they say is St. George and the dragon, which is, of course, the story of Michael throwing the dragon to the earth. So it comes down to the earth through Longinus. And you find in Anatolia, in Ephesus, and particularly in Antioch, that there are dozens of saints who went through the same thing that Longinus went through. And that is the quest. That is the new Christian spiritual Holy Grail quest, is to become what's called a soldier of Christ, who then turns from war and hatred to love and mercy and compassion. And so Longinus served Mary while she was alive, Sophia, for 11 years, and then worked with Joseph of Arimathea. And people don't understand that they came to England after they dropped off the three Marys in France with James and Maxim and Sarah, the supposed child of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. So the three Marys, Mary Cleopas, and the other Mary, not Sophia, not the mother of Mary, came to France and traveled across France as pilgrims, teaching everyone and arguing with all of the matriarchal cultures that were in the Provence and in Aquitania. And what they did was they converted all of southern France and northern Spain to Christianity and a belief in the Holy Grail, the holy blood of Christ, which propitiates but does not create vicarious atonement. The blood of Christ is there in all of us. Each one of us has a drop of that risen blood in our Holy Grail. And in that heart, in that Grail, as long as we can bring those forces of our spiritual self in, that Grail grows into an angel. It helps us become an angel through the help of the being of Sophia, the midwife of our soul. The person, literally, as Rudolf Steiner says, the person in every way except she doesn't have a body, who has been traveling along with us since 2000 BC, that every single time a person has a vision of the Grail, they are in fact encountering Sophia. Because you have a spiritual experience, Sophia comes in you, passes through you, comes back outside, becomes objective, and lets you know the spiritual step you took. In other words, the Grail, which is called Gradalis, the graded path, the step-by-step path up the mountain, is aided by the being of Anthroposophia, but also we know that the heart is created by the mothers and by Christ. So you have Sophia, the mothers, Sophia the Christ coming in, also with the being of wisdom, and you also have the being of Anthroposophia, this threefold goddess that is happening. That is the nature of the Grail. There is the top part, the middle part, and the bottom. Now, as a soldier of God, if your spear, your spine, hasn't given you the erect I am, the proper ego that can recognize love in other people, in other words, the Christ in other people, Christ in yourself, Christ in others, if you don't have that, then you haven't conquered the dragon. And that's the reason so many of these soldiers of God, whether it be St. George or Longinus or Fenarius or Minos or a dozen others, they all faced a dragon. Well, there were no dragons at that time. So what's the dragon? The dragon is your lower forces of your chakras that you haven't settled. In other words, sex, food, desire, all the lower desires. The path to hell is paved with the 7 deadly sins, and they are found in the lower chakras. And when you try to raise the energy from the lowest chakra through Kundalini, expect problems. That isn't the way that it works. You have to start in the Grail. You have to start in the heart, and you only go up. And we're going to discuss that at great length in the next talk. So what we see here is that the Holy Grail is you. It's your wisdom, it's your love, and what you do with it. And if you're like the Grail, you're going to serve everybody who comes to you everything they need. And the idea of meteorites having something to do with this is absolutely critical because they're used in the following way. Rudolf Steiner said that in these 3 previous stages of the mothers, ancient Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, he calls them something, that's what he calls them. But he says that the outer manifestation of that period of time, in the first period, they left the planet Saturn. Then it left the planet Jupiter. And then later it left the planet Mars. But in between Jupiter and Mars, you have the asteroid belt, which was a planet called Marduk. And the war in heaven was when the planet Marduk exploded and became the asteroid belt. Meteorites are those asteroids falling to Earth. Rudolf Steiner said that the iron in those meteorites every fall comes in and brings meteoric iron into the Earth's atmosphere and fights back the dragon of sulfuric breath, the dragon's breath of the summer, is fought back with the meteoric iron from the heavens. Now that may sound like sheer poppycock and craziness. And you say, what does that have to do with me? If you put meteoric iron in your blood, you will be strengthened. I have done this, and it's used as a very powerful medicament. But if you see it for what it is, this is what it is. I just came across the oldest version of creation that I know of. It's from the Bonpo culture. And it says the two creator gods, one threw a meteorite at the other one, and it cut the one in the neck. 3 drops of blood dropped down into this cauldron, and creation came about. So you're going to find this everywhere. So why is this important? It's important because of the following astronomical fact. In 2001 and in 2012, first in 2001 in Kerala, India, Kerala, 50,000 tons of blood rain fell on India. They gathered it up, they analyzed it, and they said that it was blood, human blood, hemoglobin, the whole thing, iron, the whole thing. How could this have happened? Well, just before it fell, there was meteorites came in and gigantic explosions happened. And the meteorite didn't hit the ground, and when that happens, many pieces spread. But anyway, blood rain came down. This has been recorded 80 times in written history. I've studied this, and I always thought it was an imagination. It wasn't real. It is real. So a meteorite comes, the spear, okay? The spear comes, right? And from it, it drops blood, and it drops blood into the earth, the Grail. This blood is hot in some cases. It's happened when there were battles, and it literally killed people, and it ruined everything, and it spoiled and curdled just like blood. So anything it touched was ruined. So in 2001, they gathered it up, they analyzed it, and they said, this is extraterrestrial, this is human blood, and we cannot explain it. And so they thought that that was crazy. It happened again in 2012 in Sri Lanka, same exact thing, meteorite explosion, blood rain, they tested it, same thing. Now, I'm not saying that the Holy Grail is simply an animistic astronomical event. But what I am saying is that just like the pre-Christian mysteries of Christ that predicted Christ as a descent from the Son, a Son God coming from the highest Trinity, working through the Son, coming down to give humans their ego, not to be a blood sacrifice, not to create holy grails or anything else that is in fact a relic that could be worshiped as an idol, but certainly to redeem the curse of Eve. And so we see that no matter where you look, you're going to find the feminine connected to the Holy Grail. And this mystery, because the meteorite, they said, came from the great goddess in the sky. And the blood, well, that was the blood that the women were all in charge of, the blood mysteries that they always been in charge of, the mysteries of birth, death, and rebirth, the mysteries of birthing a child, the mysteries of menses and menarche. Rudolf Steiner says everything in the universe can be found. We are a microcosm of the macrocosm except for one thing. Women between menses and menarche can have babies. And that is a cometary action where things come out of nothing and come into this realm. And comets do the same thing. So Rudolf Steiner said that only the woman has the last missing piece of the cometary action that happens in our solar system. And he says comets come in to clean the solar system. And without them, we would die from poison. So every time a woman has a baby, it is the mysteries of blood that are being revealed to us. Now, the mysteries of blood rain are shocking. Some of the mysteries that we put in the book, the hidden history of the Grail Queens, are shocking because we show that the infantada, this vow that the Spanish queens, the French queens made, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and not only did they go on pilgrimages to, the Reconquista in Spain, but also to the Holy Land. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the person who started the courts of romance, the person who the original stories were written to in terms of Cretan de Troyes and the Parsifal stories. And so we get to see that the feminine are always connected. But what is even more profound to me is a revelation I just found. And that is that Crétin de Troyes, who wrote for these courts of love in France, didn't finish his story. And so there were many people who tried to finish it. That's the reason you cannot hardly read all of the Grail literature, because there's so much of it. But there were 2 prologues, and one of them is called the Elucidation. And in the Elucidation, you have the true mysteries of the Grail in only that one particular spot. And this is what it's about. In the Elucidation, it says that everything was beautiful in the past, and that every place that there was a well, a spring, there was a maiden of the well there. And she basically was a connection to the fairyland, to the fairy world, the world of the etheric, the world where life burgeons, the world of life, our own etheric body. And these maidens had a golden cup or chalice at the well. And there was a well, any traveler could travel for a day and come to another well. And at the time, they believed in the thing called unconditional hospitality, because they believed that Odin and the other gods wandered on the earth and that you never knew when it might be a god that you were helping. So anyone, supposedly, in the Elucidation it describes, who came to one of these wells and met a maiden of the well, who came out of the well, by the way. So she's obviously something mystical. And the first one was called Melusina, and she was supposedly the mother of 5 or 6 different monarchical houses of Europe. They claimed that their queens went back to these women at the well. And when you asked for whatever food you wanted, you were given it in plenty. And if you didn't like that, if you asked for more, you'd be given more. You were given anything you needed. Well, this was the tradition. And so travelers would come to the wells and they would receive these things. Well, there was a man, a king Amangon. I don't like to say his name, but this king went to a well, coveted the golden cup, stole it, and raped the maiden of the well and took her from the well back to his castle. Everything around the well died. It became a wasteland. And this king told his men that he did this. And his men went and did this to many of these wells and brought these maidens back. That is who Arthur and his knights were fighting against. Remember, they often meet them at a well, where they meet them at what's called the Stone of Bardsey. And you tap 3 times on it, and you enter into the fairyland of Brociolanda. So these women, these maidens of the well, were the connection to the life force of the etheric that is found in the Holy Grail. And when they were taken from their wells, the land became a wasteland, and the only Grail castle that could replenish you was so hard to find that hardly anyone could find it. So the maidens of the well are the initial keepers of the Grail. And this is why, with all of the stories, the women aren't on a quest. The women are there with the Grail. They serve the Grail. They're part of the Grail procession. They're not the problem. And once the quester can find the Grail castle, ask the 3 questions, and receive this nourishment, then he can become a king along next to the queen. So you prepare yourself through this process of questing on the spiritual pathway to come to the secret of the divine feminine, the secret of the Grail cosmology, the entire evolution of what a human being was, is, and will become, is all part of the mysteries of the Grail. So that is what we attempted to do in this book, is to bring not only the Maidens of the Well, some of the new research that has come with blood rain, but we also investigated a true relic called the Spear of Antioch. Probably the only true relic that we could say could possibly be associated with that time period. And so from time to time, we are pulled in to do research and vet things. And as we were researching these Grail objects, and one was literally a cup, other objects that we were looking at, nails and so on and so forth, and we were doing this for a person who asked us to do this, of course, we found that the Spear of Antioch does have a provenance. And it was held by the queens of France and the queens of Spain. And we actually believe that the Spear of Antioch, we know exactly where it was held. It was in a vacuum-sealed area because we've had it investigated and looked at with every piece of equipment you can. And this thing was held sacred. So the relics were sacred. But according to Rudolf Steiner, there were no relics. But according to the Catholic Church, if you had the Spear of Maurice and you touched another spear to it, like the Spear of Krakow, it supposedly then became a second-class relic. So the desire for a pilgrimage to a place is not necessary, even though many people died on these pilgrimage trails in Europe and to the Holy Land. We will not find a Holy Grail. We will not find a physical Holy Grail. We will not find a physical Grail castle. It is in your head, the Grail castle. But the Grail is in your heart. And the dripping of the blood is when you yourself can become this Grail and start to nourish others. You then nourish the spiritual world. You rise up through another Grail here, into another Grail here, and you actually then become what it is you are to be in the future. This picture of the human being, which is truly the redemption of the fall of the human being that then goes back to its inherited place next to the throne of God, and in this case, becoming an angel instead of following the other path and becoming an animal. And this is what the Grail is about. It is not about blood sacrifice. We must end that. It is not about idolatry. We must end that. It is not about the curse of Eve. We must end it. We must find the I am in our hearts, and we must make certain that it is not Lucifer sitting on that throne, but that it is Christ.